What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Calvin Huynh. Calvin, how you doing today, my man?
I'm doing really good, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Before we dive into this rabbit hole of what I'm going to call stubborn fat loss protocols, can you give the listeners a little introduction about yourself for those who might not be familiar with you already?
Yeah, no problem. So I'm Calvin. I am a trainer, coach, and writer out of Southern California. I've been in the fitness industry for 5 to 6 years. In that time, I've worked at a number of gyms, and I've written for a lot of fitness websites. You guys might have seen me. I know your listeners watch, Eric Helms, T-Nation, Menno Henselmans, Legion Athletics. A lot of those I've written for. So I'm big on writing and big on the science, which I know your listeners are big fans of.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I have read a few of your articles. You write some great stuff and ultimately some pretty interesting stuff when it comes to the realm of evidence-based nutrition. You have some different ideas I'd like to say, but they are backed by the evidence. And we're going to get into some of these topics today and potentially what you're most well known for, or the most unique concept that you have proposed, which many in this space might disagree with on the surface, but they might be changing their tune on that after they listen to this discussion. So when it comes to stubborn fat loss, we understand that when we're trying to get shredded, when we're trying to lose a lot of weight, it's ultimately going to require a calorie deficit. And on top of that, we're going to need to be in that calorie deficit for a significant period of time. But there comes a point where, there's a few more pounds of fat to lose, and we're trying to tick every box to make sure that comes off, especially in the context of a bodybuilding show or a photo shoot. We need to make sure that fat comes off. So we're going to be looking at some nuances of fat loss in this discussion, or potential strategies we can utilize to get those couple of extra pounds off in those very difficult areas. So with that, we can look at the idea of spot reduction, which for most of the history of evidence-based fitness, this is just a complete fallacy. We know it's not real. You can't spot reduce fat, Calvin. We are genetically predisposed to store fat in whatever unique area that we have, but you have some ideas that are a little bit different. So can you kind of explain to the listeners why the idea of spot reduction was a myth for so long, and some potentially recent mechanisms that could explain why spot reduction is very well plausible?
Yeah, no problem. So the reason why people think spot reduction is a myth, just to put it bluntly, is because people don't actually look at the evidence. A lot of people like to claim evidence-based. It's like the cool thing to do now, to be all into science, and it sounds good, and your clients obviously want everything to be science-based, not just opinion-based. But a lot of coaches coming into the industry, and a lot of the coaches that have been in the industry that consider themselves evidence-based, you'll notice that a lot of their content isn't actually evidence-based, because evidence-based is, one, you have to look at the evidence, and two, you have to look at all the evidence. And I'm sure like a lot of people are just really guilty of either reading just an abstract and drawing a conclusion really fast, or they look up to certain really big name people who have a lot of good content, but they're kind of just regurgitating their content without actually looking at the evidence. And I think as coaches, we don't have to be like expert scientists, but we should be held accountable to the evidence. So we should know how to dissect and interpret to an extent. And as far as spot reduction, if you look at all the evidence as a whole, so I wrote a whole article on this. If you look at all the evidence, there is good reason to believe that it's possible, at least in certain ways. So the most common way that was researched that shows that it's not possible is, let's say you just do like a bicep curl, and you're in a deficit, then you don't lose fat particularly in your arms. Or if you just do like 100 crunches, that's not going to spot reduce your stomach. But we see in other lines of research, we have one good study on dieting in women with PCOS, that when they optimize their hormones based on the diet, on the macronutrients, they actually lost more fat and they lost more stubborn fat. And then if you look at body fat storage physiology, that's another thing. Is yes, largely we're genetically disposed to a certain shape. So women will always be more like pear-shaped, and men will always be more apple-shaped. But that could be optimized or de-optimized based on lifestyle. So there's still some behaviors that we can control. Like if a man has very low testosterone and very high estrogen, he will centralize fat more. So he'll store even more fat around midsection. And so we know from fat storage physiology that there's some control there. And then two other lines of research. One is topical creams, which is another thing where people are like, topical creams are BS. But I think that's one of those things where people just see other evidence-based coaches not really using it or dismissing it, and they kind of just, again, regurgitate the same information. But if you look at the evidence for topical creams, some of them are not always funded by topical cream companies. And again, that's like very minimal in the hierarchy of interpreting evidence. The study design and the participants, all that are much more important. But if you look at all the studies, they're very consistent. And while the effect sizes aren't huge, the effect sizes are pretty favorable, and they make sense if you compare that to the physiology of storage. So with topical creams, you see that more stubborn areas, when they do get targeted, they lose a little bit slower. And then if you target an area that's less stubborn, you lose it a little bit faster. And then the last line of research kind of stretches beyond the just doing a bicep curl. Is we have a couple good studies, but only one really good study. And that was in 2017. So we've had all this evidence, at least we can say, since 2017. Which was by Palumbo et al., I believe. And so instead of just doing like a bicep curl and expecting stubborn fat loss, they paired resistance training, strength training, with cardio. So the idea was, because we can mobilize fat, we can break down fat, and we have a study since 2007 that we've known this, where localized blood flow, especially from muscle contractions, they will break down the fat in that local area. But what we see in controlled research without the cardio is that fat essentially gets restored. And because of human physiology, you're more likely to get it restored in those stubborn areas. So what Palumbo did was, instead of just doing resistance training, they paired it with HIIT, essentially, high intensity interval training. So cardio and resistance training. And so the cardio would burn off that local fat that is now in your bloodstream. And what we see is that if you take a group that did upper body resistance training followed by cardio, they'll lose more upper body fat. And then if you take a group that did lower body training and they did cardio afterwards, they'll lose more lower body fat. And so all of that combined with, if you even talk to a lot of coaches, like if you talk to people who've actually tried stuff like this, it's pretty promising. So I think even just the evidence alone, it points to the fact that spot reduction in a certain way is possible. So what people saw originally with just doing resistance training, just because that one way didn't spot reduce doesn't mean spot reduction is a myth as a whole.
Yeah, fantastic. You touched on a lot of great points that we're going to dive into further later, but you outlined very nicely ultimately what evidence-based practice is. And I would like to add on to that evidence-based practice also requires you to keep up with the research, right? Mm-hmm. So, maybe a little over a decade ago, we didn't have any specific trials looking at this form of exercise for spot reduction, and as such, it wasn't possible. But if you keep up with the research, and you mentioned the study, which I believe I read it in mass when the time came when it was originally published, when you keep up with the research and you see these things evolve over time, then that it is part of evidence-based practice. You change your opinion or your stance on a topic as the data evolves. But unfortunately, as you said, many are just going to regurgitate information that's been passed down or what their favorite practitioner might have said. So they might be lost on these new studies that come out, which are changing the answer to some of these very contextual topics. You touched on there the specific protocol used in this 2017 study. can you just kind of provide a general outline for our listeners about how you might use this with some of your own clients? So touch on for us, what are the most typical stubborn fat areas, and then basically how you would align cardio and resistance training to specifically target those areas.
Gotcha. So what I do with my clients when I do implement this, and this is not something that I do with everybody, there's only in specific situations. But when I do this, I generally like to only have one area we're targeting. So like compared to hypertrophy, a lot of hypertrophy programs will, you can target more than one body part and kind of specialize in those. But I think with this, I think it's best if you just target one area. And so for men, it's almost always going to be stomach area, especially for the advanced listeners. For some of the male physique shows, legs don't matter as much, especially when they're wearing shorts. So abdominal fat, losing that is really important, getting that area shredded. So usually men is always going to be midsection area, and then women is going to be one of three areas. It's either going to be midsection, thighs, or arms sometimes, depending on the female. And so what you would do is you create a general strength training program for that person. And then if they're going to do cardio anyways, you might as well make it spot reduction, assuming I'll go over some of the caveats of spot reduction in a sec, because I'm sure some listeners are like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. But there's definitely drawbacks as well. But the benefits is you can turn your cardio into a spot reduction sort of session. So what you would do is you create a normal strength training program, and then you would reduce the volume slightly, probably by, I would say like 10%. So you'd optimize the volume, and then you cut it by 10% because you're going to be adding cardio and extra resistance training for the spot reduction. And so you would add, let's say you're trying to target the abs, you would do an ab exercise paired with a cardio exercise, and you just superset that at the end of the workout. And you can do this as frequently as you'd like, depending on the caveats. So the first caveat doesn't affect the frequency, but the first one is the caloric deficit. So you can't I always see coaches when we're talking about earlier how they're just regurgitating information. I always see coaches when they make content about this. They always say spot reduction's a myth. All you need is a caloric deficit. But those two things are not mutually separate. So those two things can go together. Spot reduction doesn't negate the deficit. So the deficit is what causes you the mechanism to lose fat, but spot reduction directs where more of that fat is coming from. So number one, you have to be in a deficit, or else you're just redistributing the substrates. And then caveat number two is, off the top of my head, what was it? Oh, caveat number two is it doesn't speed up fat loss. So people think spot reduction is speeding up fat loss. It's essentially redirecting it. So if you're trying to spot reduce your stomach, you'll lose more fat in your stomach, but you'll lose less fat in other areas compared to someone who's just losing fat more overall. So you don't get to lose more fat by doing spot reduction. You just get to redirect it. The third caveat is the interference effect. So you have to add cardio in order to spot reduce, at least significantly. And so cardio always comes with an interference effect. This means that your muscle strength and power adaptations are slightly hindered. So you have to be okay with that. But usually, for example, contest prep, they're not going to be building muscle in their big deficits. They're super low body fat anyway, so you might as well implement it. And they're going to do some sort of cardio to increase energy expenditure. So you might as well spot reduce if you need to. And then the fourth one is unwanted muscle growth. So for an area like the midsection, people want that smaller. But if you're adding resistance training volume there, then it might actually appear bigger if you gain bigger muscles there. So you have to take all of that into consideration, and you have to apply it as wisely as you can depending on the individual. So just in a general sense, for a male trying to spot reduce their stomach, I would do that superset of an ab exercise with a cardio exercise about 3 times per week. 3 times. I usually won't go more than 3 times. And I'll make the ab exercise an isometric exercise, because isometrics generally grow less muscle than dynamic contractions. And if they really don't want their waist to get big, then I won't apply progressive overload. So we'll do things like partials, or we'll make sure their like planks or hanging leg raises are the exact same amount of time, because if they're getting stronger, that muscle might grow, especially in an area where they don't train a lot. And the idea of spot reduction is to get it slimmer, get it smaller, make it appear smaller. So that's how I would apply and program spot reduction. Oh, and one more thing is that this also applies to general population. So people think this only to like bodybuilders and physique competitors, but if anything, this applies more to the general population because they have more fat to lose. So one, you'll see more of an effect, and they can get away with bigger deficits. And two, they have more to gain, because while a competitor is just trying to look good for a show, the average population, not all fat is created equal. So losing a pound of fat near your shoulder is not as helpful as losing a pound of fat around your stomach. So visceral and stomach abdominal fat has been shown to be more detrimental for health, which is why I feel like a lot of coaches dismiss this idea for their clients' detriment. Because if you apply this to general population, you can lose the same amount of fat, but you lose it in a more beneficial area. So I think it applies to both physique competitors and general population.
Excellent. A couple of quick questions there before we transition. You mentioned that you need to incorporate some sort of resistance exercise with cardio, and in the context of contest prep, we're probably going to be doing cardio anyway. Does the form of cardio matter? Because in the specific context of contest prep, I would probably imagine that most people are performing some sort of low intensity, probably brisk walking, maybe incline on the treadmill. Is that sufficient, or is there a specific mode they should be selecting here?
I think from the overall research, it shows that it doesn't matter. There are some studies that use, especially in the topical cream research, a lot of those use steady state. And then I believe the Palumbo study used something closer to HIIT. So I don't think it matters. There is one review paper that shows HIIT might be better for this, but I looked at the review and the studies themselves in the review weren't very promising. So my general recommendation right now is to just use whichever one you prefer and fits with your time and your recovery.
Great. And to add here, considering the research is probably a bit limited, though there is definitely some quality stuff in there. When we're looking at competitors and we're looking at people who are already significantly lean, in general, in the research setting, these aren't people that are going to be studied, especially when it comes to a protocol like this. Do we have reason to believe that this would be more effective for someone with only a little bit of fat to lose, or less effective compared to the general population? Maybe you've worked with physique competitors who you've noticed that this came in handy when, they were already pretty close to photo shoot or stage lean. What have you seen there?
Gotcha. So the competitors I have worked with, and I'll be honest, I haven't worked with a lot of competitors, but it's hard to tell because we don't have a control subject. We don't have a control subject to compare it to. But I can tell you that it's never been detrimental. And as far as effectiveness for the advanced population, I would say it's less effective, but sometimes more important. So it's less effective because they have less fat to lose. So like, for example, if you're dieting down, and for a male, they're still going to store most of their fat, even with spot reduction protocols. They're going to store most of their fat around the midsection because of male physiology. That's their disposition. But because once they lose all the fat in other areas, they have no choice but to lose most of it from that midsection anyways. Whereas compared to someone who's like obese, they have fat everywhere. So if you spot reduce, you're likely going to see more of an effect. And we see that in research. Some of these studies have pretty decent effect sizes. So I would say it's less effective for advanced population, but it's more important because the advanced population has likely already optimized so many things. They're willing to put in that extra effort for that extra percent of results or effects, or losing a bit more fat here just to get, it could be the difference between third and second. Even though the effect is small, the margin of error is also small. So all these people are trying to optimize these things, you might as well try to get that last 1%, which a lot of these competitors are trying to do.
Really cool. I appreciate that context there. As you mentioned, which I think is really important, there's probably no downside to utilizing one of these strategies. And again, and I think it's something that we do really well in this podcast, is that discussing these nuances. If this is the difference between third and second, or second and first potentially, and there's probably no detriment to utilizing it, it's worth trying here, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Like, especially, we don't have a study that implements cardio and the topical creams. And I mentioned the topical creams because if you talk to competitors who use it, like actually talk to people, not just, put your head in PubMed, these people swear that it works. And there's tons of like concepts and principles from bodybuilding community and from anecdote that have been proven to be right years and decades later. And we have to remember that evidence-based is actually looking at the evidence, but it's also actually having the experience as well. So I feel like a lot of coaches fall on that end of the spectrum too, where they just look at research papers, but they're not trying things out and they're not experimenting. Because if we're going to only implement things if we have like a meta-analysis for it, we're going to take like forever to get to, learn anything new and implement anything, useful to give us that edge.
Very well said. You've mentioned the effectiveness and efficacy of topical creams a couple of times here. So let's dive into the research on that specifically when it comes to spot reduction. When we're looking at these topical creams, what are the common active ingredients in these products which would explain why they might be effective?
Gotcha. So the common ingredients are yohimbine, which is already a very common supplement, caffeine, aminophylline, forskolin, glycyrrhetinic acid, and L-carnitine are the most common from all the studies that I selected from. And what we see in the research is that none of these ingredients work any particularly better than the other. In fact, the concentration doesn't even matter that much. Some studies show that like a moderate dose works better than even a high dose sometimes. And what we can logically conclude is that the exact ingredient doesn't matter that much, but the mechanism does. So what it does is simply direct blood flow and draws heat. So I haven't experimented a whole lot with topical creams, but you can pretty much feel secure if you use one that gets that area very warm, which most of them do. So that's going to direct a lot of blood flow and heat there.
Very cool. When we're kind of looking at these topical creams and their potential application, you mentioned that no specific study has combined this with cardio and resistance exercise. Calvin, you got the grant for this study. When are we applying this topical cream in relation to these other factors?
So it's really simple. All you would do is you would apply it before you start the resistance training. So it'd go apply cream to, let's say, abs, and then do like a hollow body hold, followed by an erg or treadmill or a bike, assault bike, and then you just repeat that process. But you probably don't have to reapply the cream, so you just repeat the superset itself.
Fantastic. Moving on into other little details that might make that 1% difference when we're trying to lose the last few pounds. I want to move into the general area of nutrient timing. And we know that in regards to this overall goal of losing as much fat as possible while also retaining as much muscle as possible, we're going to need to utilize a pretty high protein intake, and it would be best to split up that protein intake over multiple meals. Moving further down this rabbit hole, is there any periods of time within the day where it makes more sense to consume a little bit more protein, or it makes sense to be absolutely sure that you're having a bolus of protein at this specific time?
Yeah, so there's probably 3 times, and they have different hierarchies. So the first is post-workout. And a lot of advanced lifters are already doing this, but what we see in the research is what someone would be considered intermediate. that this impacts them as well. Because I know a lot of coaches, same thing here, where they're just posting, just eat enough protein. There's no magical time for protein. But there really is. If you look at the research, the more advanced you get, the more important post-workout protein becomes. Because, again, a lot of these studies are short studies, and they're not going to be able to find a significant difference as far as statistics go. And we know that muscle growing is a very slow process. But if you look at the actual effect sizes and you compare them study to study, they almost always trend up for post-workout protein, especially in advanced lifters. So like I said, the more advanced you get, the more important this becomes. The reason for it is, one, your genetic ceiling gets closer. So you're building incrementally less muscle, and your anabolic window, which a lot of people think is a myth, but it isn't, that gets smaller. So once you stimulate muscle protein synthesis from your workout, that local muscle has a higher ceiling of the muscle full effect, meaning it's basically time for it to build protein. It's already constructing and breaking down protein, and there's a net positive of construction, assuming you train correctly and you're not just doing like 10,000 sets. So what you have to do now is you have to provide the building blocks, aka the amino acids, which come from the whole protein sources. And so that window gets really small, and that window also peaks at a certain time. And that peak comes very early for advanced lifters, like usually within 2 to 4 hours. So a meal, ideally, the biggest meal of your day should come post-workout, because we see just beyond protein that the micronutrients might play a role too, and just total energy intake for that time period is really important. So that's the most important one, is post-workout protein for advanced lifters. And then the second one is pre-workout protein. We see that you don't want to go into a workout fasted. You want to spike amino acids in the blood, and this lowers muscle protein breakdown. So it helps your net protein balance by the end of the day by having protein pre-workout. What we also see is that's less important than post-workout. So hierarchy, we go post-workout, then pre-workout. And then the third one is a very theoretical one, but it's one of those where it doesn't hurt, but you might as well do it, is pre-bed protein. Pre-bed protein has a lot of studies, and they're almost always trash, if I'm being honest. They either don't match for total protein intake, or they don't include strength training, which if we can just get one study that does that, we have a decent answer of where this is at. But theoretically, it makes sense because you're not having any protein as you sleep. So it will help spike muscle protein synthesis and help suppress muscle protein breakdown. And that's also when you're producing anabolic hormones and your muscles are repairing. So it just makes sense that if you can control for it, you might as well have a bolus of protein before bed, 20 to 40 grams.
Fantastic. When it comes to these nuances, I don't know, perhaps I'm just an optimist when it comes to these sorts of things, but I'm always under the impression that for most of us who are passionate about this, we dedicate so much time to this anyway. Why would we not try to check every single box possible in order to maximize our outcomes? As you mentioned, I think, in this evidence-based community, perhaps some individuals are a little more pessimistic than myself, and they'll say, well, just hit your total protein. It doesn't really matter. Maybe you get it in 2 meals, maybe you get it in 5. Who cares, man? And then especially when it comes to things like casein protein before bed, they're like, it's too much. It's ridiculous. Where I'm on the other side of the fence and I'm like, well, maybe casein protein gives you a 0.001% difference. And, maybe post-workout protein and having 4 to 5 protein-rich meals over the course of the day, we're racking up all these 0.001%. You do that every day. And I don't know. I believe that it's going to amount to something in the long term. I believe Cody Hahn in his newsletter recently put out something about pre-bed casein protein as well. I think was it a 2018 review, I think, from perhaps Snyder, or maybe it was an individual study. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about there.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I think it is right, a 2018 review from Snyder.
Yeah, and again, it's not going to hurt, so why not take advantage of that? It sounds like you alluded to there, when it comes to post-workout protein, it would be best to have some sort of whole food source, which, again, even for those who kind of prioritize post-workout protein, they would probably opt for a whey protein shake. Not necessarily bad, but it sounds like you're saying this might not be optimal in comparison to having a mixed meal.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Mixed meals pretty much always either perform just as good as whey protein or better in research. I think we have a study by Jorn Tromelin. I'm probably butchering
Hmm.
his last name, but he did one where he looked at the synthetic response of post-workout meals of protein, and a whole meal compared to a just like a whey source. The whole meal spikes muscle protein synthesis higher, and they concluded it's due to micronutrients, which in my opinion makes sense because I think that's another underlooked aspect is micronutrients. A lot of people focus on the macros, but a lot of these micronutrients play big key roles in muscle growth, strength development, acutely and chronically. So things like vitamin D, zinc, magnesium, even calcium for bones. So a lot of these things, again, like you said, they might be nuances and they might just increase it like this much, but the minutia no longer becomes minutia when you're starting to reach your genetic ceiling. Like what was once not a big deal is now, hey, I should probably do this, or else I'm not going to see very significant results, if any at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think the whole field of the food matrix and the potential here, it's growing. It's quite interesting. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking of a study that looked at whole eggs versus just egg whites, and
Mm-hmm.
perhaps whole eggs being more beneficial or more anabolic in nature due to all of the micronutrients it provides. If you look at things like choline and what that can potentially do in terms of the process of muscle growth. So I think that's something that's super interesting. And as you mentioned, these specific vitamins and minerals, what comes to mind is potentially using some sort of milk source as opposed to just, water and whey protein just to get your protein, but prioritizing those vitamins and minerals as well could be some interesting benefits.
Yeah, for sure.
Looking at the other macronutrients, in terms of carbohydrate, when it comes to the evidence-based natural bodybuilding sphere, it's more or less widely accepted that during contest prep, we're going to keep our fat intake to a minimum and we're going to try to displace as many calories as possible towards carbohydrates, mostly due to its potential effects on resistance training performance. But ultimately, at the end of the day, calories are going to get low in contest prep and we're not cutting protein. So
Mm-hmm.
carbs are going to get pretty low. With that being said, where should we be placing the brunt of our carbohydrates when they do get low? Should we just be equally distributing these over the course of the day? Should we be having a large bolus pre-workout to fuel our exercise? Should it be post-workout to restore the glycogen we depleted? Or maybe even we should be prioritizing them before bed to improve our sleep, which typically gets compromised as you get very lean.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there are two key areas. So I think the first that has more evidence is actually pre-bed. So we don't have as many studies on pre-bed carbs as compared to pre-bed protein, but the studies we do have on pre-bed carbs are of higher quality. So usually longer term, much better control, and equal macronutrients between groups. So what we see is that people who eat carbs before bed, they generally sleep better, they generally lose more fat, retain or build more muscle, and have better hormonal levels and better appetite suppression. Because generally speaking, a lot of people are going to be hungrier at night when they want to like munch on things. Not to mention that in some studies, muscle is more insulin sensitive at night compared to in the morning. So it makes sense to eat your carbs pre-bed. And anyone who knows this, eating a big bowl of pasta or something, you feel sleepy, you want to go to sleep, like it's going to help you recover. So I think that's going to be the number one. In the overall scheme of things, it's still less important than protein in my opinion. But I think as far as carbs go, that's the most important timing area if you're going to optimize that. And then the next most important is pre-workout. So this is also kind of controversial as well because people think of carbohydrates as the energy macro, but really carbohydrates, it only becomes the particular energy macro when it comes to very particular situations. And I don't believe that the evidence supports these situations as far as most bodybuilding situations. So most bodybuilders, unless you're like extremely, extremely advanced, most bodybuilders are just doing resistance training, at most once a day. And they're doing maybe a little bit of cardio, maybe like 20 minutes during that same session or another time. But what the research shows is that pre-workout carbs, there's only a benefit to like mixed sports, so like boxing and soccer, mixed martial arts, especially when you train twice a day. When it comes to just the pre-workout for resistance training, while we do depend on glucose as a fuel source, it doesn't need to be endogenous, or it doesn't need to be consumed. We can already have it within our muscles. And what we see is that we actually don't go through that much muscle glycogen. Like we think that resistance training, like it burns so much that our biceps are just burning like 60% of our glycogen already. Like we've seen articles and, when we're younger that says like this workout will burn all your glycogen off. But what we see in research, for example, is bodybuilders, advanced bodybuilders who train 20 sets of quads to failure only burn about 20 to 30% of their glycogen in their quads. And I guarantee most people are watching are not strong enough as advanced bodybuilders, and they do not do 20 sets of quads in one workout to failure. So you're actually not going through that much. And what we see in the research is, especially when compared to energy matched situations. So if you take like 20 grams of carbs, or let's say you take like 200 calories of carbs, and you compare that to 200 calories of either protein, fat, or a combination of any of the macros, you see the effects are the same. The only times that carbs may perform better is when they're compared to fasted training. And people generally misinterpret those studies and say, carbs are so important pre-workout, but it's mostly food is important pre-workout, and carbs might have some benefit. So that's why I put it second in the hierarchy. And you generally don't need a lot for the effect. Like some of these studies use like 15, 20, 25 grams, even in trained lifters. So the idea that you have to eat like a giant bowl of rice or pasta or drink fruit juice and all these supplements with like the sugary supplements for replenishing your glycogen, all that is really unnecessary. You just need some carbs pre-workout, and chances are you're going to optimize everything as long as you're doing traditional bodybuilding, resistance training, and some cardio. But when you get to the realm of like, let's say CrossFit, soccer, 3-hour workouts for sports, that's when pre-workout carbs become important. And so those are the two timing protocols for carbohydrates. And then post-workout carbs, I don't really worry about that, because as long as you have carbohydrates, especially if you're eating them at those times I mentioned, you're going to replenish glycogen by the time your next workout comes anyways. So again, unless you're working out the same muscle group 2 times a day, really, really like crazy hard with different energy system demands beyond resistance training, carbohydrates are just not as sensitive as people think.
Yeah, I think that last point there in particular was excellent, in the fact that having carbohydrates pre-bed, you're probably killing 2 birds with 1 stone there in terms of glycogen restoration, but then also benefiting your sleep. I couldn't agree more with your overall take on carbohydrates. I've been working on an article in regards to this. Bodybuilding is ultimately a very niche population. There's just not much research. We're just starting to get some pretty good studies on these particular subjects. And it seems like a lot of our notions on nutrition were just more or less passed down from the sports nutrition realm, where even to this day, when we look at endurance sports, things you mentioned like soccer, there's still this recommendation to consume 1 to 4 grams per kg of carbohydrate 1 to 4 hours before training, because we see these positive effects for endurance sport. That doesn't necessarily mean bodybuilding, where you have a 10-set leg day and it takes you 60 minutes. You're going to be fine. And we have some very recent papers looking at carbohydrate feeding pre-workout, and also in these studies they're analyzing the subject's baseline diet. They're having them track their intake, and it looks like for people who are consuming adequate overall energy over the course of the day, they might come into that workout with more or less at least 80% of their glycogen full, just from adequate energy intake and adequate carbohydrate consumption over the course of the day. And for that reason, obsessing over the pre-workout intake doesn't seem to make much of a difference for performance.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because a lot of that is just to sell supplements, to sell carbohydrate supplements.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's probably some placebo going on there as well, right? If someone always has carbohydrates before their workout and then we're telling them, hey, man, you don't need it. It's really not essential as long as you're eating enough for the course of the day. And they take them out and they have a bad workout and they be like, you guys are the worst. You have no idea what you're talking about. And meanwhile, they're thinking to themselves the whole time, I didn't have my carbs. There's no way this leg day is going to go down well.
Yeah, we actually have studies on that. There's one that I really like, which took a carbohydrate pre-workout group and another group who ate a placebo and it had 0 calories, so it didn't have any carbohydrates.
Yeah.
And it had texture though, so it felt like food. And both groups performed the same.
So, I know what you're talking about there, and that just becomes very interesting because then we consider, well, why do people experience a positive effect from having carbohydrates pre-workout, and maybe as you mentioned this placebo, and it's basically this fiber substance where you think you're eating food, but more or less is just causing some gastric distension, and it's stretching those receptors in the stomach. And maybe it's just a product of not getting really hungry during your workout, and that's more or less the primary mechanism displaying these outcomes.
For sure.
So that kind of wraps up things on our macronutrients here. I want to transition into supplements. If you think there's anything else interesting there, I guess topical creams could be considered an ergogenic aid of sorts in this. Most people tend to think of caffeine potentially being a fat-burning supplement. Is there anything else that comes to mind which you think people don't consider often but could be worthwhile?
Like as far as fat burning goes?
Yeah.
So I think caffeine's obviously the big obvious one that people are taking. On the topic of caffeine though, I think it is very beneficial to cycle on and off of caffeine. I think a lot of caffeine users just use it perpetually. And what we see in the research is that what you think is an enhanced effect is just you being so dependent on it that without it, you feel like you're not getting the same effect, but you've actually just become tolerant already. So caffeine, the other one is yohimbine, which doesn't perform too well in research, but there is some studies to show it might help with fasted training. It's also a stimulant. And the last one is ephedrine, which I believe is illegal in the United States, but I think you can get it in certain plants, like herb plants from out of the country. And all 3 of these should be cycled. So you should be taking them for about like a week on and a week off. And ideally, you time it to where when you need it most, so that last week of dieting is when you can take at least 2 of these. I would say caffeine and ephedrine. And these, again, will have very small effects. I never recommend any of these besides caffeine to Gen Pop clients, but for the advanced lifter, they may apply. And that's pretty much as good as it's going to get for fat burning. There's not really any supplement that enhances fat burning, but there are 2 other supplements that kind of help in the realm of fat loss, which is one is psyllium husk. It's basically just a fiber supplement. You eat enough fiber and you take the supplement on top of that, it helps you get even more fiber. And this is great for appetite suppression, because I think that's one of the most underlooked aspects of fat loss. A lot of people just worry about their macros, but they're not worrying about the psychology and the behavior and the routines to adequately suppress appetite, because a lot of that is starts from the brain. So psyllium husk helps you get more fiber, and it helps pretty much retain more water. You'll feel fuller, and you'll generally eat less from what the research shows. And then the second one, which a lot of people love to bash on, but research does show that it has benefits in this realm, and I've used this with many clients, both Gen Pop and advanced, is apple cider vinegar. I don't know if you'd really count that as a supplement. It obviously doesn't burn fat or do any of those magical things that the gurus claim, but we do have research that shows when you take apple cider vinegar, you not only feel less urge to eat, but you actually eat less in the following meals. So I generally recommend people take that with water, and it's like 2 calories. So again, no drawback, might as well do it. So do that like during the day, and you want to take it with water so it doesn't burn your teeth and your tongue. And you might notice that it will suppress your appetite a little bit better, because as you get down to contest prep, as an advanced lifter, dieting to like the low body fat percentages, hunger is like all the way up, like desire to eat is all the way up, like your mood is just everywhere and you hate life. So anything you can do to suppress appetite is worth it in my book.
Yeah, man, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I couldn't agree more. That's all extremely interesting, and definitely some relevant things to consider. I think these are pretty unique concepts, and this discussion is definitely something that's not the norm. These aren't typical ideas proposed by those in this space. Before we wrap things up, was there anything else that comes to mind unrelated to the general areas we talked about that you want to mention in terms of reducing stubborn fat?
I guess I would just encourage the viewers to push the boundaries. Like just me personally, I'm someone who's trained mostly Gen Pop, and I still hate the content that's given to Gen Pop. I feel like we treat people as if they can't learn. Like if you look at a lot of the fitness content nowadays, even from like very advanced coaches, all they post is get in a deficit, eat more protein. The only supplement that works is creatine. And it's just really boring, the same stuff over and over. And I know, because I train in-person clients and online, and I read the research. I know from just talking to people that stuff gets old. Like they're looking to push the boundaries. Like we treat people as if, like they're children, but really a lot of these people, they want to start simple. They want to start seeing results, but a lot of them want to push those boundaries and learn more and see what they can optimize. Because once you've built a habit and lifestyle with the things that already work, you have a lot of room to add more implementation, and you might as well do it because who doesn't want better results? And I just encourage people to push the boundaries a little bit more and not get so complacent with the really common advice that everyone already gives.
Brilliant. I think that's perhaps the primary thing I'm trying to change with this podcast. Nothing aggravates me more when someone asks one of these popular professionals who works with like very advanced athletes, and they basically insult them for asking such a nuanced question, and then it just comes back to, well, it doesn't matter what's optimal if you can't adhere to it. As someone who's a bit further down this road, who follows the research, formal education like yourself, I don't want to hear it. I get it. Adherence is number one. If you can't stick to it, it's never going to work. But let's push that aside, all right? And let's talk about the fun stuff. Let's talk about the nitty-gritty details that can make a difference for the people who are absolutely obsessed with this, and they're going to do whatever it takes to get the most out of it.
Yeah, for sure. I see that all the time. That bugs the crap out of me because I feel like there's just this listener who's asking just a genuine question and wants to know, and then usually a lot of these big name people just like drop them down and be like, it doesn't matter, just stick to your calories and your protein, you'll be good.
Excellent. I think that's going to be the snippet for this episode, and it's something I'm particularly fond of. All right, Calvin, I love this discussion. We got into the weeds, dropped some knowledge bombs, talked about lots of research. For people who want to learn more about you and aren't already supporting you, where should they go?
So my handle for everything is Awesome Fitness Science. So website is awesomefitnessscience.com, and then YouTube and Instagram at Awesome Fitness Science.
And all of those will be in the show notes. That does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Thanks for listening, everyone.